Welcome. Today's guest, I have Dr. Christine Hyde. I'm very excited. She is the founder and clinical director of the New Jersey Center for Sex Therapy and has been a practicing sex therapist for over 25 years. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Hyde to describe a little bit more about herself and her background.
Great. Hi, Tina. Thank you so much for the invite. So I'm a sex therapist. That means I work with couples and individuals on all kinds of sexual problems, right? Sexual desire, sexual arousal, sexual orgasm, any kind of sexual pain, any kind of sexual challenge that an individual or couple has. That's the kind of work I do. So after you've ruled out anything physical, anything medical, I'm the next best step to getting some help sexually.
I love it. So I'm going to just go straight into the questions I had because for my audience, this is more probably specific to them. Number one, how normal is it to have a drop in libido in midlife?
So, what I'll say is that sex and sexual desire waxes and wanes throughout your life, right? So, when you're a teenager in your 20s, sex is super high. There's a lot more desire during that time. Then, when people have children in their late 20s or 30s, it kind of plummets a bit because people are very active and busy, potentially having rearing children. Then in their 40s and 50s, when there's a little bit more of a lull and a lot of the child rearing is gone, if you're in a relationship, it has a tendency to kind of go back into a lull also. Some of it is environmental, some of it is situational, and some of it is hormonal, right? But it's not hormonal for everyone. So that means some people, the dip in hormones, estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, potentially during perimenopause, menopause, etc. Sometimes it adversely affects some people, and other people it doesn't adversely affect. So it's really person to person. But I would certainly say, Tina, it is not uncommon for there to be a dip in libido based on for a lot of reasons in midlife.
Okay, that's helpful because I think sometimes if that happens, um, it can be feel like, oh my God, is something wrong with me?
Mhm.
Um, or I don't feel quite like myself. One of the questions I had was on, especially if it's hormonal related. I had heard a couples therapist once suggest um, HRT hormone therapy uh, for the woman for libido. So I wanted to, and if there's, let's just say there's no other symptoms like, there's not any major hot flashes, anything that's going to be debilitating her everyday life. What are your thoughts on hormone therapy for libido?
So, what I would say is, first of all, I'm not a medical doctor, right? So, I'm not giving anyone medical advice today. That's not my role and that's not my expertise. But what I will say anecdotally, with clients that I've worked with, HRT is a very personal decision. Generally speaking, I come from a place of minimalism. So, the least amount of intervention externally possible, that's probably the better approach, right? So really kind of thinking about the pros and cons of this hormone replacement therapy, understanding how it will affect you. But please, please be under absolutely no delusion that the HRT will fix your desire. I will basically promise you it is extremely unlikely to completely fix the desire issue. It is not a magic pill. It is not a magic cream. It is not a magic lotion where you'll suddenly be like, oh, I want to have sex. I want to have it all the time. I'm back. I'm back to my 20s and back to my 30s. I can pretty much guarantee that will not occur. So if that's your expectation, maybe reconsider that approach and maybe take what I would say a more holistic approach, which is really kind of talking through the issues, talking through the underlying desire patterns that you will no longer have, and really kind of asking yourself or understanding more importantly that your brain is the most important sexual organ. So where your mind is at, your body will or will not follow. And that's what needs to be addressed.
It's so interesting that going back to how everything comes from the mind. Like even with, I was thinking when people have problems with sleep, they want to go to Ambien or something when, at least, cognitive behavioral therapy seems to be the most effective. Um, so, what are some of the reasons behind hormonal changes that might not necessarily be the main reason, but attribute to a drop in libido?
Sure, there's a lot of reasons why people, especially women, we have less desire, right? One is if we've been with a partner longer than about 2.5 years, your desire is going to drop, right? Because when you initially meet a new partner, you go into what's called the infatuation phase. Infatuation phase is you are naturally neurochemically high as a kite on dopamine, adrenaline, norepinephrine, serotonin, all the good feeling hormones, all the happy hormones are circulating when we have a new novel relationship. Human beings crave novelty, they crave newness, they crave learning and new experiences. And when you've been with the same old person, oh, it's you again this morning, it makes it kind of challenging and difficult to feel a general spark or any kind of general passion because it's kind of same old salami and cheese sandwich here. You know, it makes it challenging to want to go and experience what I call the sexual procedure or the pattern we kind of get into. Right? If you jump in the shower, most of us don't say, what should I wash first? Most of us will start with our hair and I'll work our way down, and we don't even think about what we're going to wash. We just kind of do it. That's what happens to people's sex lives over time.
Mhm.
They get into bed and they go, all right, he's going to give me the old rub on the shoulder. And then he's going to roll over and then he's going to try to cop a feel on the boob. And then we're going to and then I'm going to feign sleep or start to pretend snore, or I'm going to give the reason why I don't want to be doing this and shut the whole show down. Right. Because
Mhm.
it's kind of like, I don't want to watch that movie again. And so it makes it difficult to want to be interested when we've seen that movie hundreds of times before.
That makes it so that makes me think about, how I know what we see on the outside and what happens behind closed doors are different, but sometimes it seems like you might see a couple that have been married for years, like, and they're still like very sweet and touchy. And that could be
Yes.
anyone. What is that happening? So you're saying even for someone like that, like they still have to work quite diligently at keeping it fresh.
So what I do as a sex therapist is I find it really important to kind of redefine sex, right? We've
Hmm.
all been socialized to essentially a hierarchical view of sex. First base, second base, third base, home run. And when you have a hierarchical view of sex, it's kind of like me saying, hey, if you feel like dessert, you have to have an appetizer, you have to have a main course, you have to have an intermezzo and wine pairings. And after all that, then you can have dessert. Right. So what happens is if I'm dreading all of that, I'm going to stop it at the appetizer. I'm going to say, you know what? I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry. I'm good. Right. I'm going to immediately kind of stop the touch, because if I think that touch, that arm rub or that little pat on the butt thing, oh, I know what he wants, I know what we're gonna have. We're gonna have that same meal again and I don't want it. Right. So if you anticipate that every touch leads or is going to lead to some sort of potential intercourse, and maybe you don't want intercourse tonight, you just want to snuggle, you just want to spoon, you're like, you know what, if I snuggle and spoon, he is going to get aroused, then I'm going to feel badly, I don't want to do anything else, so you know what, I'm going to forego the snuggle and the spoon. It's a grave error. If you can kind of teach each other and grow together that sometimes a cuddle is just a cuddle. Let's just enjoy the cuddle. Sometimes a shower together and soaping each other up is just that. Sometimes it doesn't lead to masturbation exercises in the shower, sometimes it doesn't lead to any more sexuality or intercourse or anything else. It's kind of like if you always need to have everything, you don't want anything. So what I find, believe it or not, is that a lot of couples who are super affectionate, you really shouldn't assume that they're having a ton of sex.
Oh, that's a
Because I see lots of couples who do have affection, but it never makes it over the threshold of the affection. And what I find is, again, men are more genitally focused in general compared to women. And there are reasons for that, Tina. The reasons
Mhm,
are men's organs are outside their body. Okay.
mhm.
The average man will touch his penis about 144 times a day.
Oh my god. Wow.
They
I would
move it, they rearrange it, they tweak it, they tuck it, they check on it. They want to make sure the penis is a happy organ, okay?
Uh-huh.
And again, we as women and men touch our noses over 80 times a day. Why
Mhm.
is that? Because it's external. We have a different awareness of things that are external. We'll
Wow,
touch,
that's
we
mhm.
as women will touch our ears more often during the day than we touch our vulvas to wipe pee and change tampons and do any kind of hygiene stuff that we need. But other than
Yeah.
that, for most of us, we're not thinking about our genitals.
Mm. That
Another
that makes
reason,
sense.
yeah, another reason, Tina, is when men have arousal, they get a twinge in their penis and it physiologically feels really, really good. Okay.
Mm.
And so I'll
Mhm.
usually do this test in session. I'll ask the man, hey, I'll ask the woman, when a man gets an erection, can he tell if he's not looking? And she'll say, yeah. I'll say, does it physiologically feel good to have an erection? Yes. And if you were to touch immediately that erection, would it feel much better in some way? The answer is yes to all those questions, right? And then
Mhm.
I'll ask the gentleman, I'll say, all right, do women feel good when they get wet? And most men will say yes. And then the second question will be, can she tell when she's wet? And the man will say, of course. And then I'll say, does that wetness create an engorgement in the clitoris? Does it create a desire for that clitoris or that vulva to be touched? And the man will say, I think so. I would assume so. And we know that the answers to all three of those questions is no. No, we as women do not know when we're wet unless we touch ourselves. We as
Mm.
women, that wetness doesn't physiologically feel like a tingle or like the beginning of an orgasm for us at all. And number three, our clitoris being engorged, there's no like, oh, you have to touch me right now. Like that really doesn't really come upon us until like 20 or 25 minutes of stimulation of some description.
Mhm.
And I don't mean genital stimulation. I mean touching and kissing and caressing and talking and snuggling and, something else, not genitally focused.
Mm.
So you can see the mismatch, Tina. Man
Yeah.
is ready to go in 30 seconds to 2 minutes of immediately being touched. And women are like, what? Hold up. I don't even know if I'm aroused. And it's like 20 minutes into this ordeal.
Yeah.
Huge
Um,
mismatch.
does I remember you once saying so in terms of age or like midlife, is there a point where hormonally come where we're more at the same stage? Like if it
Yes. So the great news, the fantastic news is really we are most well matched sexually in our 50s, 60s, and 70s, right? Because it takes longer for a man to get an erection. Men's erections come and go. Their sustainability isn't always a solid, firm erection the whole time. It actually rarely is. It gives women time to get aroused. It also forces some level of creativity, I would hope, on the man's part to do something, to continue something, to continue the stimulation of the woman while he may wait or need to also be stimulated to also get an erection. Right. So the pace is much more well matched in our 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I would say only a little bit in our 40s. It really starts much better in our 50s.
so what I'm hearing is that over 50 sex can be even better
That's
than
right. I would argue as a sex therapist that the best
uh-huh.
sex of your life is 50 and up. And there's lots of
I
reasons
love
for that.
that. Uh-huh.
Absolutely. I would absolutely hands down, in my nearly 28 years experience of doing this sex therapy, the best sex is 50 and up. If you have good communication,
Hmm.
if you have a mutual understanding, if you're good at having general pleasure. If you don't have pleasure in your overall life, you are not going to have pleasure in your sexual life. There's a direct
Hmm.
correlation.
What do you mean by overall pleasure?
What I mean is, if I ask you, hey, what do you do for fun? In one of my first sessions, I'll ask the individual and the couple, each individual, what brings you joy? What makes you happy? What makes you laugh? What do you love to do? And if a
Mm-hmm.
person says, I don't know, or a person says, not much, or a person
Mm.
tells me, I don't really have any time for that,
Yeah.
then I know there is no way on planet Earth that you are going to have a good sex life. So I will actually begin by helping that individual take time and develop outside pleasure, or pleasure that has nothing to do with sex,
Hmm.
way in advance of even being able to introduce sexuality.
That's so interesting. So the ability to like let yourself relax and just enjoy is like
Is
is
a
a
need to have.
predisposition.
Yes, it's a
Uh,
need to have in
yeah.
advance of even
Yeah.
thinking about a sexual life. So that's something everyone can do. Take
Mm-hmm.
an inventory of yourself. Ask yourself, what do I do for me? What do I enjoy? What makes me laugh? What makes me happy? And if you
Yeah.
don't have much, that's the starting point. We can't talk about sex until you can reconnect with enjoyment. Because otherwise, if enjoyment's not a priority in your everyday life at all, then
Yeah.
certainly bedroom pleasure is not going to make the list.
That's actually quite enlightening. Like that, I guess someone wouldn't normally think about. Um, let's assume someone does have has their general enjoyment outside. What are I and I know it's dependent per couple, but in general, like what are some suggested sexual therapy strategies if the couple decides they want to try to have the same kind of sex as they did earlier in their marriage or even in their life, when they're in their 20s.
Sure. Okay. So the first thing I tell people is we looking in the rear view mirror is a
Mhm.
waste of time. By that I mean there is no such thing as recreating. Okay? I don't believe that you're going to mimic or copy the honeymoon infatuation phase. That's not to say you can't have numerous sparks of excitement. It's not to say you can't add novelty, but think about what you liked when you were 8 or 9 years old in terms of your food choices, and think about the more sophisticated and developed person hopefully you've become, right? So at 8 or 9, I may really despise Brussels sprouts. But in my 20s and 30s, I experienced caramelized Brussels sprouts with a little bit of shallots and some light balsamic glaze. And
Yeah.
now I'm like, wow, Brussels sprouts are the best ever. You have to
Yeah.
think about your sexual life in this way. You have to say to yourself, okay, I swung from the chandeliers. I had sex on the side of the road. I did all these kinds of crazy, wild things in my 20s and early 30s during the honeymoon phase when I was high as a kite, naturally, neurochemically. I don't really want to be shivering in the cold in a car anymore. I want to be in someplace comfortable. I want to be in some place that's beautiful and aesthetically pleasing, right? So it's really trying to reinvent or evolve or develop a more sophisticated, a more luxurious, a more classy sexual life. So I
Hmm.
don't see it as, oh, we're grieving the loss of back then. I see it as, no, now we're eating at 5-star Michelin star restaurants because we can afford to do that, or
Yeah.
we can enjoy things in a very different way because we have life experience. The other advantage of getting a little bit older as a woman is hopefully you develop a little bit more of the efforts, I call it, right? The screw it, I can just do this. Like, I don't care what everyone else thinks. My hopefully a lot of the body images issues have begun to resolve themselves. Hopefully, you have a little bit more personal acceptance. Hopefully, you realize the stuff you worried about in your 20s is so not what you have to worry about or be concerned anymore.
Hmm.
About. So I think it's really gaining perspective. And instead of trying to recreate, I think it's newly creating together. What do we want the sex life for the second half of our life, or the last third of our life, to look like?
Yep.
Do we want to make it important? What would make it mutually pleasurable? These are the conversations I really invite couples to have.
You're making me think about, like, how does someone know what, is there a difference between couples therapy and sex therapy? And how would a couple know, which, if there is a difference, like which one they need?
Okay. So, I wish I could represent that the majority of couples therapists will address the sexual issues. Unfortunately, I think because of our own personal discomfort, even as therapists,
Mhm.
sometimes those issues don't really, they may get glazed over, glossed over, but they aren't really addressed necessarily simultaneously. What I will say about the majority of sex therapists, and again, I'm
Mhm.
not representing all of us, right? The majority of sex therapists have to have been or have to be excellent couples therapists first, with a specialization in sexuality. So, really, just to kind of promote sex therapy, I will say the advantage of sex therapy, in my professional opinion, is you should be, in quotations, you should be getting 2 for 1. You should
Mm.
essentially be getting your sexual symptom addressed, but all within the couple's context, all within what's going on in your couple. And so I
Okay.
kind of see it as a 2 for 1.
Okay. No, that's very helpful because I know sometimes there is, like you said, a couples therapist who might not really delve into the sex part. Um, So, in terms of people's libido, I know it can be very embarrassing, maybe even just for one of the partners, or even if someone's not in a relationship, to notice their the change in their libido. They'll be embarrassed about even maybe bringing it up to a professional. Like, what are some of your expert thoughts on how on these feelings, like expressing them, or
Okay.
or trying to deal with them?
So what I always find, or very very often find, is that sex is the elephant in the living room, right? We both know we haven't physically connected in 3 months, or in 3 years, or in some of my cases 13 years. Okay? So it can be a few months, it can be a couple of years, it could be over a decade, right?
Mhm.
And obviously, the longer somebody doesn't do something, the larger the elephants, right? Or the more
Yeah.
uncomfortable to talk about. If it's only been 3 or 4 weeks only, I'll say, but it's very common for people not to have sex that often. You
Hmm.
know, if you're addressing it after a few months have gone by intermittently, well, in those cases, for sure, you can resolve it much more quickly, right? When things have gone longer, it may take a bit more time. But really, I call it the bravery factor. If you're going to be brave, and if you're going to say, I value this and this is important to me, I know it takes a significant amount of vulnerability to be able to talk to your partner. But I think, Tina, it's less about the talk and more about the tone. In
Mm.
other words, the tone you take, if you take an accusatory or blaming tone with your partner, like, we haven't had sex in this amount of time because you this, or you that, or you never, or you always, or The moment somebody starts attacking or really kind of accusing, the person shut down, they're crawling up into a hole, and they are not going to deal with this well. You're not going to get any forward momentum, and the person just feels blamed, and that is not going to solve the problem.
Hmm.
A much better approach, Tina, might be, I've been thinking a lot about this and I really miss connecting with you. Or I really miss, the hugs and the touch we used to have that seem to be completely gone. And I propose, or I suggest that maybe we can start snuggling on the couch a little bit. Is that something that you're interested in? Is that something
Hmm.
that you miss? Is that something that you would like?
Hmm.
Now I'm inviting someone to have a discussion with me versus I'm declaring and accusing and finger pointing.
Yeah, and it makes the other person feel wanted too, like, "Oh, I miss this with you."
Right. And if it isn't, let's just pretend the sex wasn't great, but you want
Hmm.
better sex. You
Hmm.
can say, hey, we both haven't really connected in a physical way. Maybe some of it was quantity, maybe some of it was quality. Maybe we can figure out ways that would be satisfying to you and to me to work this out. What do you think?
Yeah. I'm just envisioning how if there's a couple and one of them is like kind of like thinking about this bigger picture, and how the other one, maybe who might not be as open to uh, sex therapy in general, how that could pose like an obstacle. Like, we don't need someone else to help, but there's resistance. I'm sure you've probably encountered that. Like, even with the nicest approach, how does
I
one
I
deal
I
with?
I, I, w- I would agree, right? Because we were growing up, or we've been raised, all of us, in a society that really gives a lot of mixed messages about sexuality. It gives a
Mhm.
lot of false advertising that pornography is real sex, and that's how real people have sex. So what happens is we it's easier, uh, often for men, believe it or not, to go and masturbate to porn than to try and figure out how to re-engage with sex. And
Mhm.
so instead of assuming your partner is probably asexual, which is possible, which is a different issue, but possible, if you don't start with that assumption, and instead you assume that they are sexual, but they're really focusing on sexuality with themselves. And why do people focus on sexuality with themselves, particularly men? Because there's no performance anxiety around it. There's
Mm.
nobody watching me, there's nobody criticizing me. I'm not
Mhm.
on stage hoping to get an erection, and then I'm not on stage hoping to maintain an erection. And then I'm not on stage hoping not to ejaculate too quickly, or I'm not on stage hoping to try to being able to ejaculate. Men have a
Mm.
lot more visible anticipatory anxiety, okay?
Mhm.
Because their body has to do something in their mind if they're going to
Yeah.
be sexual, versus there's all kinds of sex. And what I usually say is, anything that you're not sharing with your children, your in laws, your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors is sex. So it may not be intercourse sex, but it's a
Mhm.
sexual connection. So hand holding is sex. Feeding each other strawberries romantically is sex. Snuggling on the couch is sex. Washing each other in the shower is sex. It may not be intercourse or genitally focused sex, but it's still
Mhm.
sex. So broadening your view of sex, and with this partner having some difficulty, I think you need to understand and acknowledge, listen, I appreciate that maybe being by yourself sexually, potentially for all these years, has been easier because you haven't known how to approach me, or we haven't done this in so long. It's like we assume we can't, or it's going to be awkward. And what I say is, it's worth it to get and work through the awkwardness, because if you haven't gone ice skating in 5 years, it's not going to be pretty the first time you get on the ice. You're going to be flailing, you're going to
Mhm.
fall, you're going to hit your head, you're going to like have to laugh at yourself quite a bit. But if
Mhm.
you stick with it instead of stopping halfway around the first turn, after 20 or 30 ways around the rink, you're going to be okay. And you're going to
Mhm.
stand and it's going to feel good. And hey, maybe you actually might enjoy it again.
Mhm. So let's say someone, or someone's a couple is thinking about trying sex therapy, and I'm sure occurs in a lot of people's mind, like, how long will it take, or how do you know when, okay, we're ready to not have, this third person helping us out?
So, the role of the sex therapist is really to be your sexual tour guide. So, my job is to basically put the couple in the back of the van and I drive the car and I explain things and I do a lot of sexual education, a lot of sexual information. By helping people be really educated and informed, they develop a sense of sexual expertise. And when I feel like I'm knowledgeable and I know this stuff, I'm more likely to actually do something or try something new because I'm
Mhm.
less intimidated. So, my role as the sex therapist is essentially to give a lot of information and education. And then eventually the couple moves to the front seat of the car and we do driving lessons. And then eventually they take the driver's seat and I get out of the car and you're off and on your way. And if you ever need a booster shot or you get into a little rut, you can
Mhm.
call me. I'm like AAA for sex, and I will come rescue, help you a little bit through the difficulty, 1 or 2 sessions, and then you're back
Yeah.
and off and on your way again.
You have the best analogies. I
Yeah, I'm
mean, very,
sexual
very real
AAA.
world. Yeah, sexual triple A. And then my final question is, as we like, therapy can be expensive. Well, I'm a big proponent of always having a coach or some, someone guiding, even whether it's sex or sleep, or
Yeah.
because it's can be hard to DIY it. But I also do understand that it's not going to necessarily be within everybody's financial resources. So, if a couple or a person couldn't afford a sex therapist or a couples therapist, um, what could they do? Or are there any books that you might recommend as a starting point?
Okay, sure. So, firstly, I want you to know that sex therapists are at different price points, right? So,
Hmm.
I am my counseling center. I'm the director. Obviously, my fee is higher than, let's say, my colleagues or the younger people that I supervise. But they're all professionals. They all have supervision under, the person who does the sex therapy primarily, and there is almost an affordable price point for nearly everybody. That's the first thing.
Mm, okay.
The second piece is that oftentimes, while the symptom may be sexuality, the underlying issue is a mental health issue, right? It's an anxiety disorder, it's a depressive disorder. That's really the problem. The problem is I'm overridden with anxiety that I can't launch. Like I think about it, I say I'm going to do it, and then tonight comes and I don't do it again. And I don't
Hmm.
do it again. So to me, that's a mental health issue. And what I will tell you is the majority of people with general insurance also, under their policy of medical, they have general mental health insurance. So
Hmm.
oftentimes it will be covered as a general mental health issue and
Hmm.
does get some form of reimbursement through your insurance company.
Oh, it's good to know.
So that's
Okay.
something to know, that it can be potentially affordable, not always, but
Yeah.
often under your mental health coverage, right?
Yeah.
And then lastly, if, sometimes I get a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old calling me saying, I have early ejaculation, or I don't have a lot of desire, or X, Y, and Z has happened, help me. And obviously, legally, I can't see anyone without their parental consent. And obviously, in some cases, the kid is not willing to, have their parents sign off. And then I explained that the best thing to do is to get what I call the sex Bible. because I think if you can get a lot of information and education and get that sexual expertise I talked about, you'll feel more confident in asking for what you need, or knowing what's normal, or knowing, how do I do this? I tell people every day, sex is not natural, folks. Sex is not natural. It's not just going to happen. Okay. Sex is a skill and a behavior and a choice, and you need to learn the skill, choose the behaviors, and make the choice.
Mm.
Right. And
Yeah.
so, again, that sexual expertise. So, the book, the Bible that I recommend,
Yeah.
it's called The Guide to Getting It On. It's
Hmm.
available on Amazon. It's in its 10th edition. And what I will say is, it is all things sexual. And the best
Hmm.
way to read this book is actually not in order. You get the book. It's really pretty thick. It's about $25, really inexpensive. It's a worthwhile investment. You open the table of contents up and you just pick a topic of choice and you read that chapter like you would an article.
I love that. It's like
And
a choose your own
instead,
adventure.
yes, like a choose your adventure. So instead, there's less obligation, it's less daunting, and you're
Hmm.
focusing on the pieces immediately that you feel driven to understand.
Hmm.
So that's the best book. In terms of lower desire, understanding the science of female sexuality and desire, there's a great book by Emily Nagoski, Nagoskyi, and that is called Come As You Are. And it's the science of sexuality, especially in women. And
Hmm.
it's phenomenal in explaining how women's sex drive is completely different from men's, and having an understanding of that. And that's good for both yourself. And after you've read it, it's good for your partner to read, because he
Hmm.
or she also needs to understand that.
That's fantastic. I'll put both of those references
Excellent.
in the show notes. So, Dr. Hyde, how can you guys find her to find out whether you want to contact her or make an appointment? Uh, First, your website, which is njsextherapy.com.
Yes.
And they can find you on your Instagram, the handle being Sex Consulting with Dr. Hyde.
Thank you so much, Tina. I really appreciate the invite. It's always been fun.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for listening.